The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Riverside Conservatory of Music. It was the kind of building that made people stop and stare. Tall columns, glass windows that sparkled like diamonds, and doors so polished you could see your reflection in them. This wasn't just any music school. This was where the best of the best came to prove themselves. Elena Rodriguez stood at the bottom of those steps, her fingers gripping the handle of her violin case so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She had been standing there for almost 5 minutes now, just staring up at the building. Her violin case wasn't like the sleek black ones she'd seen other students carrying. Hers was brown, scratched from years of use with a strap that had been sewn back together twice. Her grandmother had bought it for her at a pawn shop when she was 7 years old. She finally took a deep breath and climbed the steps. With each step, her heart beat faster. Today was the annual recital, the event that every music student at the conservatory spent months preparing for. It was where careers were launched, where scouts came looking for the next big talent, where legends were born. As Elena pushed through the heavy doors, the cool air conditioning hit her face. The entrance hall was massive, with a ceiling so high it made her dizzy to look up. A crystal chandelier hung in the center, throwing little rainbows across the white walls. Students moved through the space like they owned it, their designer shoes clicking against the marble floor. They wore clothes that probably cost more than her family's monthly rent. Elena looked down at her own dress. It was navy blue, simple, the kind you could find at any discount store. Her mother had ironed it carefully that morning, making sure every wrinkle was gone. Her shoes were black flats, comfortable but clearly worn. She'd polished them until they shined, but they still looked old next to everyone else's expensive heels and leather boots. "Excuse me," someone said, bumping past her without really looking. Elena stumbled slightly, adjusting her grip on her violin case. No one apologized. No one even glanced back. She followed the signs toward the backstage area, walking down a long hallway lined with photographs of famous musicians who had studied here. Their faces stared down at her, confident, polished, perfect. She wondered if any of them had ever felt as out of place as she did right now. The backstage waiting area was already crowded with performers. Some were doing vocal warm-ups, their voices rising and falling in scales. Others sat with their instruments, fingers moving silently over keys or strings, practicing one last time. Elena found an empty chair in the corner and sat down, placing her violin case carefully on her lap. "Oh my God, is that a vintage case?" a girl next to her said, leaning over. For a moment, Elena's heart lifted. Maybe she was going to make a friend. Then the girl continued, "I mean, vintage in a thrift store kind of way." Her friends giggled and they moved to sit somewhere else. Elena felt her face grow hot. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the chair and never be seen again. Instead, she focused on opening her violin case, checking that everything was secure. The violin itself was beautiful, the only truly beautiful thing she owned. The wood glowed warm and golden under the fluorescent lights. It had been her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations. Well, what do we have here? Elena looked up to see 3 professors standing nearby. She recognized them from the conservatory website. Professor Richard Blackwell was in the center, tall, gray-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her family's car. He was the head of the string department, famous for being brilliant and equally famous for being harsh. "Is that the scholarship student?" one of the other professors whispered, but not quietly enough. Professor Blackwell nodded, his eyes moving from Elena's worn shoes to her simple dress to her old violin case. "I suppose we have to give everyone a chance," he said, his voice dripping with something Elena couldn't quite name. Pity, disdain, though I'm not sure how admissions thought she'd fit in here. The other professors chuckled. Elena felt like she'd been slapped. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but her throat felt tight and her voice seemed to have disappeared. Besides, what could she say? That she'd worked 3 jobs to afford the application fee? That she'd practiced 8 hours a day for years? That she'd won competitions in her home state? "I just hope she doesn't embarrass us too badly," Professor Blackwell continued, still talking as if Elena wasn't sitting right there. "The board is already questioning our scholarship program. We don't need to give them more ammunition." The professors moved away, still talking in low voices. Elena sat frozen in her chair. Around her, other students pretended not to have heard, but she could see them sneaking glances at her, whispering to each other. She opened her violin case and touched the smooth wood of her instrument. Her hands were shaking. This was supposed to be the best day of her life. She'd dreamed about performing on a real stage since she was a little girl. She'd imagined it 1,000 times, walking out to applause, playing her heart out, making her family proud, but now, sitting in this cold backstage area, surrounded by people who looked at her like she didn't belong, Elena felt smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. Maybe the professors were right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe she'd made a terrible mistake thinking she could compete with students who'd had private lessons since they were toddlers, who'd traveled to Europe to study with masters, who'd never had to worry about whether they could afford new strings. A young woman with a clipboard walked through, calling out names and performance times. When she got to Elena, she barely glanced up. "Elena Rodriguez, you'll be performing the Paganini Caprice. You're scheduled first right after opening remarks. First, the worst slot possible." Everyone knew that going first meant the audience wasn't settled yet, that people were still finding their seats, that no one was really paying attention. It was the slot they gave to beginners, to people they didn't expect much from. Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The clipboard woman moved on, shouting names and times to the rest of the performers. Around her, the backstage area buzzed with energy and excitement. Students hugged each other, wished each other luck, shared nervous laughs. Elena sat alone in her corner, holding her grandmother's violin, feeling like an outsider at a party she'd never been invited to. She closed her eyes and tried to remember why she was here. Not for the professors who mocked her, not for the students who ignored her. She was here because music was the only language she'd ever truly understood. She was here because when she played, something inside her came alive. She was here because her grandmother had believed in her, even when no one else did. But right now, sitting in this cold chair with judgment pressing down on her from all sides, Elena wasn't sure belief was enough. The rehearsal room felt like a courtroom, and Elena was the one on trial. Professor Blackwell stood near the piano, arms crossed over his chest, while two other professors sat in the front row of chairs. The pianist, a middle-aged woman with perfect posture and an expensive watch, sat waiting at the grand piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. "Whenever you're ready," Professor Blackwell said, his voice flat and uninterested. He didn't even look at Elena directly. Instead, he was flipping through papers on his clipboard as if he had 100 more important things to do. Elena stepped onto the small stage area, her violin tucked under her arm. Her hands were trembling so badly she was afraid everyone could see it. She'd performed dozens of times before, in school auditoriums, at local competitions, even at her church. But none of those places had felt like this. None of those audiences had looked at her with such cold, measuring eyes. She lifted her violin to her shoulder and positioned her bow. Just as she was about to start tuning, Professor Blackwell's voice cut through the silence. "Stop." Elena froze. The bow hovered above the strings. "Your posture is all wrong," he said, finally looking at her. "Shoulders back, chin up. And for heaven's sake, relax your grip. You're holding that bow like it's going to run away from you." Heat rushed to Elena's face. Behind Professor Blackwell, one of the other professors, a woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, whispered something to her colleague. They both smiled, but not in a kind way. Elena adjusted her posture, trying to remember everything her grandmother had taught her about proper form. She relaxed her shoulders, lifted her chin, loosened her bow grip. Her hands were shaking even more now. "Better, I suppose," Professor Blackwell said with a sigh. "Though I have to wonder how you made it through auditions with such basic technical issues." "Shall we try again?" Elena nodded. She placed the bow on the strings and began to tune. The notes came out scratchy and uncertain. Her fingers felt clumsy, like they belonged to someone else. This wasn't how she usually played. Normally her violin sang. Normally the music flowed from her like breathing. But right now, with all these critical eyes watching her, everything felt wrong. "Are you nervous?" the pianist asked, her voice gentler than the professor's. Elena glanced at her and nodded. The pianist gave her a small smile. "Take a breath. You'll be fine." But Professor Blackwell cut in before Elena could feel any comfort from those words. "Nervous? This is just rehearsal. If you can't handle rehearsal, how exactly do you plan to perform in front of 200 people? He turned to the other professors. "This is what concerns me about our current admission standards. Technical skill on paper doesn't always translate to actual performance capability." Elena felt something crack inside her chest. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't usually like this, that she could play this piece in her sleep. that she'd practiced it so many times the notes were written in her bones, but her voice wouldn't come. All she could do was stand there holding her violin, feeling smaller and smaller with each passing second. Perhaps we should give her a chance to actually play something, the silver-haired professor said. There was amusement in her voice, like she was watching a show. I'm curious to see what all the fuss was about. The audition committee seemed quite impressed with her recording. Recordings can be edited, Professor Blackwell said dismissively. Anyone can sound good with enough takes and audio processing. Real talent shows up in live performance. Elena's grip tightened on her violin. She thought about her audition recording, the one she'd made in her tiny bedroom at home using her phone propped up on a stack of books. There had been no editing, no special equipment. Just her violin, and 8 hours of recording until she got a take she was happy with. She'd submitted that recording with hands shaking, knowing it wasn't as polished as what other students would send in with their professional sound engineers and expensive equipment. Go ahead then, Professor Blackwell said, waving his hand impatiently. Let's see what you can do. From the beginning of the Paganini? Whenever you're ready. The pianist played the opening chords. Elena lifted her bow. This was it, her chance to show them she belonged here. She started to play, but barely 3 notes in, Professor Blackwell held up his hand. Stop, stop, stop. He walked closer to the stage, shaking his head. Your intonation is off. That B was flat. Did you not hear it? Elena felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. She would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. I'm sorry, she managed to say. Can I try again? Professor Blackwell exchanged a look with the other professors, a look that said everything. A look that said she was wasting their time, a look that said she didn't belong here. I'm not sure there's much point, he said slowly. Perhaps you're just not ready for this level of performance. There's no shame in that. Not everyone is cut out for the main stage. We have smaller recitals, student showcases. Maybe one of those would be more appropriate for your current skill level. The silver-haired professor nodded in agreement. It might be kinder, really. Less pressure. You'd feel more comfortable. Elena stood there, violin in hand, feeling the weight of their words crushing down on her. They were trying to cut her from the performance. Right here, right now, they were trying to push her out. I can do this, Elena said quietly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but at least it was there. Please, let me try one more time. Professor Blackwell sighed heavily, like she was asking him to move a mountain. Fine, one more attempt. But I'm telling you now, if you can't handle rehearsal, you're not performing tonight. I won't have the conservatory's reputation damaged because we felt sorry for a scholarship student. Those words hit Elena like a punch to the stomach. Is that what they thought? That she was here because people felt sorry for her? Not because she was good, not because she'd earned her place, but because they were doing charity work? She lifted her violin again. This time, her hands weren't just shaking. They were trembling so hard she could barely hold the bow steady. The pianist started the introduction again, and Elena began to play. She made it through maybe 30 seconds before Professor Blackwell stopped her again. That's enough. Thank you, Miss Rodriguez. His voice was final. I think it's clear that you need more time before you're ready for a performance of this caliber. We'll remove you from tonight's program and... No. The word came out stronger than Elena expected. Everyone turned to look at her in surprise. She swallowed hard. No, please. I know I can do better. I'm just nervous. Please don't take me out of the program. Professor Blackwell's expression hardened. This isn't about nerves. This is about standards. This conservatory has a reputation to maintain. Then let me maintain it, Elena said, her voice growing stronger. I earned my place here. My audition got me in. I worked for this. Your audition recording, Professor Blackwell said coldly, which, as I mentioned, could have been heavily edited. Live performance is different. And what you've shown me today suggests you're not prepared. The room fell silent. The pianist looked uncomfortable. The other professors watched with interest, like they were witnessing some kind of drama they could gossip about later. Elena felt something inside her shift. These people had already decided she would fail. They'd decided it the moment they saw her worn shoes and her old violin case. They'd decided it before she even played a single note. Nothing she did in this rehearsal would change their minds. I'll perform tonight, Elena said quietly. I have that right. My name is on the program. Professor Blackwell's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might physically remove her from the room. Then he gave a short, sharp nod. Fine, you'll go first. right after opening remarks, before the audience is even properly seated. That way, when you... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Struggle, it won't disrupt the flow of the more accomplished performances. It wasn't really a compromise. Going first was a punishment, a way to minimize the damage they expected her to cause. But at least she would still get to perform. Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak anymore. She carefully placed her violin back in its case and walked out of the rehearsal room. Behind her, she heard the professor's voices, no longer bothering to whisper. That's going to be a disaster. I give her 30 seconds before she freezes up completely. Why did we ever start this scholarship program? Their laughter followed her down the hallway, echoing off the marble walls, settling into her bones like a cold, heavy weight. Elena found herself wandering the hallways of the conservatory, her violin case hanging heavy from her shoulder. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to move, needed to get away from that rehearsal room and the voices that still echoed in her head. The hallways were quieter now. Most students were either in their final practice sessions or getting ready in the backstage area. Elena turned a corner and found herself in a section of the building she hadn't explored before. The walls here were covered in old photographs, black and white images of past recitals, famous musicians who had walked these same halls decades ago. She was about to turn back when she heard voices coming from a room ahead. The door was slightly open, and she recognized Professor Blackwell's voice immediately. Elena knew she should walk away. Eavesdropping was wrong, but her feet seemed frozen to the floor, and despite herself, she found herself listening. I still can't believe we're letting her perform, Professor Blackwell was saying. Did you see her in rehearsal? Complete disaster. Her hands were shaking so badly I'm surprised she could even hold the bow. Well, technically her name is on the printed program, another voice replied. The silver-haired professor from the rehearsal. We can't just cut her without cause. Not without cause. Professor Blackwell's voice rose slightly. Her performance in rehearsal is all the cause we need. But fine, if we can't cut her, we can at least minimize the damage. What did you have in mind? A third voice asked. Elena thought it might be Professor Chen, the head of the piano department. She's scheduled first, right after my opening remarks, Professor Blackwell said. Elena could hear the smugness in his voice. Perfect timing, really. The audience won't be fully seated yet. People will still be finding their spots, programs will be rustling, the usual chaos of the beginning. No one pays much attention to the first performer anyway. That's actually quite clever, the silver-haired professor said with a laugh. Get it over with quickly. By the time we get to the real talent, everyone will have forgotten about her. Exactly, Professor Blackwell continued. We'll keep her introduction brief. No background, no mention of the scholarship program. Just her name and the piece. She'll play, people will give polite applause, and we'll move on. With any luck, by the time the evening is over, no one will even remember she was on the program. There was a pause, and then Professor Chen's voice. Do you really think she's that bad? I mean, she must have had something special in her audition to get accepted. Come on, David, Professor Blackwell said dismissively. You know as well as I do that the scholarship committee has, let's say, different standards than the regular admissions board. They're looking for diversity numbers, feel-good stories. A poor girl from nowhere with a violin. It's exactly the kind of thing that looks good in our promotional materials. But her actual talent is mediocre at best, Professor Blackwell cut him off. Trust me, I've been teaching for 30 years. I can spot real talent from a mile away. This girl? She's had some basic training, sure, probably decent by small-town standards. But here, at the Riverside Conservatory, she's completely out of her depth. It's honestly embarrassing that we put her in this position. I almost feel sorry for her, the silver-haired professor said, though her tone suggested she didn't feel sorry at all. She probably thought this was her big chance, poor thing. Reality is going to hit hard when she walks out on that stage. Well, hopefully she'll learn something from this, Professor Blackwell said. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let someone fail. Then they can be realistic about their limitations and pursue something more suitable. The professors laughed, not cruel laughter exactly, but the casual, dismissive kind that somehow hurt worse. They were talking about destroying someone's dreams as casually as if they were discussing the weather. Elena felt her knees go weak. She leaned against the wall, her violin case sliding down to rest on the floor beside her. She'd known they doubted her. She'd known they looked down on her. But hearing it spelled out so clearly, Hearing them laugh about her failure before she'd even had a chance to really try, it was too much. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold marble floor, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her vision blurred with tears, but she blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't cry, not here, not where someone might see her. But oh, how badly she wanted to. She wanted to cry for every hour she'd spent practicing in her tiny bedroom, while her mother worked double shifts at the hospital. She wanted to cry for every competition she'd won that no one here knew about or cared about. She wanted to cry for her grandmother, who had believed so fiercely that Elena had something special, something the world needed to hear. Maybe her grandmother had been wrong. Maybe love had blinded her to reality. Maybe Elena was just a girl who was decent by small-town standards, but would never be good enough for places like this. The voices in the room had moved on to discussing other students, other parts of the program. Elena forced herself to stand up. Her legs felt shaky like she'd just run a marathon. She picked up her violin case and walked away as quietly as she could, her footsteps barely making a sound on the marble floor. She found a practice room at the end of another hallway, one of the small ones that students used for last-minute preparation. It was empty, thank goodness. Elena locked the door behind her and set her violin case on the single chair in the room. The practice room was tiny, barely bigger than a closet, with plain white walls and a small mirror. There was no grand piano here, no crystal chandelier, no marble floors. Just a simple space with basic soundproofing and fluorescent lighting that flickered occasionally. Elena opened her violin case and looked at her instrument. In the harsh light of the practice room, it didn't look as beautiful as it usually did. She could see the scratches in the wood, the places where the varnish had worn thin. It was an old violin, well-loved but showing its age. Not like the expensive instruments the other students carried, some of which cost more than a car. She lifted the violin out and held it in her hands. It felt familiar, comfortable, like an old friend. This violin had been with her through everything. Her first recital at age 8, her grandmother's funeral at 12, her first competition win at 14. They'd grown up together in a way. A single tear fell onto the wood. Elena wiped it away quickly, afraid of damaging the finish. Then another tear fell, and another. Soon she was crying silently, her shoulders shaking, tears streaming down her face and dripping onto her navy blue dress. She thought about her mother, who had taken extra shifts for months to pay for her application fees and travel expenses to get here. She thought about her little brother who had given her his savings, $43 in crumpled bills and coins, to help buy a new dress for the recital. She thought about her music teacher from home, Mr. Patterson, who had written her recommendation letter and told her she was the most talented student he'd ever taught. They all believed in her. They all thought she was special. But maybe they were all wrong. Maybe they just didn't know any better because they'd never seen real talent, the kind of talent that walked the halls of places like the Riverside Conservatory. Elena looked at her reflection in the small mirror. Her eyes were red, her makeup smudged. She looked exactly like what Professor Blackwell thought she was, a poor girl out of her depth, playing at being something she wasn't. She set her violin down carefully and pulled out her phone. Her mother had sent her a text that morning. "Break a leg tonight, mija. We're all so proud of you. Abuela is watching from heaven." Make her proud. Fresh tears spilled down Elena's cheeks. How could she make anyone proud when she couldn't even get through a rehearsal without falling apart? How could she honor her grandmother's memory when the professors were literally planning for her to fail? For a wild moment, Elena considered not performing at all. She could just leave, pack up her violin, walk out of the conservatory, get on a bus, and go home. She could tell everyone there had been a scheduling conflict or that she'd gotten sick, or any number of lies that would be easier than admitting the truth, that she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong, that everyone here could see it except her. But then what? Go home and face her mother's disappointed eyes? Tell her little brother that his $43 had been wasted? Look at her grandmother's photograph hanging in their living room and admit she'd given up? Elena picked up her violin again and held it close to her chest. The wood was warm now, heated by her hands. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to play music just for the joy of it. Before conservatories and professors and judgmental eyes. She remembered being 10 years old, playing in her grandmother's tiny apartment. The old woman's eyes closed in bliss as she listened. When you play, Mija, her grandmother used to say, don't play for them. Play for you. Play for the music itself. The rest doesn't matter. But it did matter. The professors mattered. The audience mattered. This performance mattered, because it might be her only chance to prove she belonged somewhere like this. And based on what she'd just overheard, everyone was already certain she would fail. Elena sat in that small practice room for what felt like hours, though the clock on the wall told her it had only been 20 minutes. Her violin lay across her lap, and she stared at nothing in particular, her mind a swirl of doubt and fear and anger. Then her phone buzzed. Another text from her mother. Remember what Abuela always said, music is a gift you give, not a performance you perfect. Elena's throat tightened. Her grandmother, Abuela Rosa. She closed her eyes and let herself remember. The apartment had been small, just 3 rooms on the 4th floor of a building with an elevator that never worked. The walls were thin enough that you could hear neighbors arguing or cooking or watching TV. But when Abuela Rosa played her violin, none of that mattered. The whole world seemed to stop and listen. Elena remembered being 6 years old, pressing her nose against the window while her grandmother played. The sun would stream through the glass, catching the dust particles in the air and making them dance like tiny stars. And her grandmother's music would fill every corner of that small space, making it feel bigger somehow, like the walls had disappeared and they were playing in a concert hall. Come here. Pequena, Abuela Rosa would say, patting the worn cushion beside her on the couch. Let me show you something magical. Elena would climb up and her grandmother would place the violin in her small hands. It had felt enormous then, impossibly big for a child, but Abuela Rosa's weathered hands would guide hers, showing her how to hold the bow, how to position her fingers, how to make the strings sing. Music isn't about being perfect, her grandmother would say, her Spanish accent thick and warm. It's about telling the truth. Every note you play should be honest. You understand? 6-year-old Elena had nodded, though she didn't really understand. Not then. Her grandmother had grown up in a tiny village in Mexico where she'd learned to play on a violin held together with wire and hope. She'd been brilliant, everyone said so. Teachers had wanted to send her to music schools in the city, maybe even to the capital. But her family had been poor, poorer than Elena could even imagine. There was no money for schools or lessons or travel. By the time she was 16, she'd married and had her first child. The violin had become something she played at home, for family gatherings, for church services. I had my chance to be famous, Abuela Rosa would tell Elena years later, when she was old enough to understand. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe the world wasn't ready for a poor Mexican girl with a beat-up violin. But that doesn't matter. I made music. I had joy. That's what matters. But Elena had seen the sadness in her grandmother's eyes when she said it, the what might have been that she carried quietly, the dreams she'd folded up and put away like old clothes. When Elena showed real talent at age 8, Abuela Rosa had sold her jewelry, not that there was much, just a few pieces of silver, a ring that had been her mother's. She'd used the money to buy Elena her first proper violin from a pawn shop. Not a great violin, but a real one that could carry a true sound. You're going to have the chances I never had, Abuela Rosa had said, pressing the violin case into Elena's hands. Promise me you'll take them. Promise me you won't let fear stop you, Elena had promised. She'd been 8 years old and hadn't really understood what she was promising, but she'd meant it with her whole heart. The years that followed had been full of music. Abuela Rosa had taught her everything she knew. And when Elena had surpassed her grandmother's skills around age 11, they'd found Mr. Patterson, a retired music teacher who gave lessons for almost nothing because he loved teaching. Elena had practiced every day. While other kids played video games or watched TV, she'd been in her room with her violin. Her fingers had developed calluses. Her neck had developed a permanent mark from where the violin rested. Her mother had complained about the squeaky sounds at first, but even she had grown to love the music that eventually emerged. By age 12, Elena had been good. Really good. Good enough to win a regional competition. Good enough that Mr. Patterson had started talking about conservatories and scholarships and futures. And then Abuela Rosa had gotten sick. Elena remembered the hospital room, the beeping machines, the way her grandmother's hands had looked so small and fragile against the white sheets. Those hands that had guided hers, that had made such beautiful music, suddenly seemed like they belonged to a stranger. Play for me, mija, Abuela Rosa had whispered. Her voice had been weak, but her eyes had been fierce. "Bring your violin next time and play for me." But there hadn't been a next time. Abuela Rosa had died that night quietly in her sleep. She was 73 years old, and she'd never gotten to play in a real concert hall. She'd never gotten to see her name on a program or hear an audience applaud just for her. All her talent, all her music had lived and died in that small apartment with the broken elevator. Elena remembered the funeral. She'd played at it, a piece her grandmother had loved, a simple folk song from her village. Elena had cried while she played, tears streaming down her face, but she hadn't stopped. She'd played it perfectly, every note true, because that's what her grandmother would have wanted. Afterward, her mother had given her Abuela Rosa's violin, the good one, the one her grandmother had bought herself years ago when she'd saved up enough money. It was older than Elena, worn smooth by decades of playing, but it had a sound that made you stop and listen. "She wanted you to have this," her mother had said. "She said you were going to do all the things she never got to do. She believed in you more than anyone." That violin was the one Elena carried now, the one in her lap right now, sitting in this practice room, while professors discussed her inevitable failure. Elena opened her eyes and looked down at the instrument. She could see where her grandmother's fingers had worn grooves in the fingerboard. She could see the small scratch near the bridge where Abuela Rosa had accidentally dropped it years ago. Every mark, every imperfection told a story, and suddenly Elena felt something shift inside her. It started as a small spark in her chest and grew until it filled her whole body with warmth. It wasn't confidence exactly. It was something deeper than that. It was purpose. She thought about Professor Blackwell's words. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let someone fail. But he was wrong. The kindest thing you could do was let someone try. Let them step onto that stage, let them give everything they had. Let them find out what they were truly capable of. Success or failure, that wasn't the point. The trying was the point. Her grandmother had never gotten to try. She'd never gotten to stand on a stage like the one waiting for Elena tonight. She'd never gotten to hold her bow in front of an audience and say, "Listen to me, I have something to tell you." But Elena could. Elena would. She lifted the violin to her shoulder and positioned her bow. The practice room was empty, but she played anyway. She didn't play the Paganini caprice she was supposed to perform tonight. Instead, she played that folk song from her grandmother's village, the one she'd played at the funeral. Her fingers moved across the strings, and the sound that came out was different from what she'd produced in the rehearsal. There was no shaking now, no uncertainty. The notes were clear and true, each one exactly where it needed to be. She played it once, then again. And with each repetition, she felt more of her grandmother in the music. She felt the strength of a woman who had lived with unfulfilled dreams but had never become bitter. She felt the love that had guided her hands when she was 6 years old. She felt the fierce hope that had sold jewelry to buy a pawnshop violin for a little girl who showed promise. When you play, Misha, you speak a language everyone understands. Her grandmother's voice was so clear in her memory it was like she was standing right there in the practice room. Make them listen. Elena lowered her violin and looked at herself in the small mirror. Her eyes were still red from crying, but there was something different in them now, something harder, stronger. She thought about Professor Blackwell arranging for her to go first, hoping the chaos of the opening would drown out her performance. She thought about him keeping her introduction brief, erasing her story before she even had a chance to tell it with her music. A small smile crossed Elena's face. Let them underestimate her. Let them expect her to fail. Let them arrange everything for her quiet, forgettable disaster. She would give them something else entirely. Elena picked up her phone and looked at the photo she kept as her background. Her grandmother at age 30, holding her violin, eyes closed in concentration. In the photo, Abuela Rosa looked fierce and beautiful and completely alive. "This one's for you, Abuela," Elena whispered to the image. "I'm going to take that chance you never got. I'm going to walk onto that stage and I'm going to play like my life depends on it, 'cause maybe it does. Maybe this moment matters. Maybe this is what everything has been leading to." She carefully packed her violin back in its case and stood up. Her legs were steady now. Her hands had stopped shaking. She looked at herself one more time in the mirror and straightened her simple navy blue dress. She didn't look like the other students with their designer clothes and expensive instruments. She didn't look like she belonged in a place as fancy as the Riverside Conservatory. But she looked like herself. She looked like her grandmother's granddaughter. And right now, that was enough. The concert hall was magnificent in a way that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. She stood in the wings, peeking out through a gap in the heavy velvet curtains, watching as people filed in to find their seats. The ceiling arched high above, painted with classical scenes of musicians and angels. 3 massive crystal chandeliers hung suspended, their light casting a warm glow across rows and rows of plush red seats. The stage itself was huge, with a gleaming black grand piano positioned to one side and a single spotlight waiting in the center. Elena had never seen so many well-dressed people in one place. Women in evening gowns and diamonds, men in suits that probably cost more than her mother made in a month. She recognized some faces from the conservatory's promotional materials, former students who had gone on to play with major orchestras, music critics from important newspapers, wealthy donors who funded scholarships like the one that had gotten her here. She wondered if any of them knew their money had paid for a girl that the professors considered a mistake. 5 minutes to curtain, a stage manager whispered, walking past with his headset on. Other students crowded the backstage area, doing last-minute warm-ups, adjusting their clothes, murmuring encouragement to each other. Elena stood apart from them, holding her violin case, trying to keep her breathing steady. She watched Professor Blackwell walk onto the stage. The audience quieted immediately, though people were still shuffling into their seats, still opening programs, still settling in, just like he'd planned. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Professor Blackwell began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "Welcome to the Riverside Conservatory's annual spring recital. We're delighted to have you join us tonight as we showcase the exceptional talent of our students." He went on, talking about the conservatory's history, thanking donors, acknowledging special guests. Elena only half listened. Her fingers moved unconsciously, practicing positions on the neck of her violin case, muscle memory taking over. Tonight's program features a carefully curated selection of challenging repertoire, Professor Blackwell continued. Our students have spent months preparing these pieces, working tirelessly to meet the high standards we expect at Riverside. High standards. Elena thought about the rehearsal, about his face when he'd suggested she wasn't ready. She wondered if he'd considered just how challenging the piece she'd chosen really was. Paganini's Caprice No. 24. One of the most technically difficult pieces ever written for violin. Most professional violinists spent years building up to it. Most music students wouldn't dare attempt it until their final year, if ever. It was a piece designed to be nearly impossible, written by a man who was rumored to have sold his soul to the devil in exchange for impossible technique. When Elena had submitted it as her performance choice months ago, Mr. Patterson had been worried. "Are you sure, Elena? It's incredibly difficult. There are other pieces that would show off your skills without quite so much risk." But Elena had been sure. If she was going to perform at a conservatory like Riverside, she was going to perform something that mattered, something that would prove she belonged there. Now, standing in the wings and listening to Professor Blackwell's smooth voice, she wondered if she'd been foolish. Maybe she should have chosen something safer, something where there was less room for disaster. "We'll begin this evening with a special performance," Professor Blackwell was saying. Elena's attention snapped back. "Elena Rodriguez will be playing Paganini's Caprice No. 24. That was it. No mention of where she was from. No mention of the scholarship program. No mention of anything at all. Just her name and the piece exactly as he'd planned. A few people in the audience applauded politely, but most were still getting settled, still talking quietly to their companions. The stage manager appeared at Elena's elbow. "You're on. Break a leg." Elena's heart was pounding so hard she thought the entire audience might hear it. She picked up her violin case with hands that wanted to shake but refused to let them. She'd been nervous before performances plenty of times, but this was different. This felt like standing at the edge of a cliff looking down into darkness. She walked out onto the stage, her simple flats making almost no sound on the polished wood. The spotlight hit her bright and hot, and suddenly she couldn't see the audience anymore. Just darkness beyond the light. Which was almost worse because she could hear them. The rustle of programs. Someone coughing. Whispered conversations that didn't stop when she appeared. Elena walked to the center of the stage, placed her violin case on the ground and opened it. Her hands were steady now, moving through motions she'd practiced thousands of times. She lifted her grandmother's violin out, feeling its familiar weight, its warmth. She checked the tuning quickly, perfect as always. She'd tuned it 3 times already tonight, but she checked again anyway. When she stood and lifted the violin to her shoulder, she caught a glimpse of the front row. Professor Blackwell sat there, arms crossed, his face set in an expression of patient resignation. Next to him, the silver-haired professor leaned over to whisper something. They both smiled, but not at Elena, at each other, like they were sharing a private joke. Elena looked away and found her spot, the sweet spot in the center of the stage where the acoustics would carry her sound perfectly. She positioned her feet, adjusted her posture, and lifted her bow. The hall hadn't quieted down. People were still settling in, still talking. Some weren't even looking at the stage. In the back, she could see a group of older men examining their programs, probably trying to figure out who she was. For one terrible moment, Elena felt exactly like that girl from the rehearsal, small, uncertain, out of place. She felt the weight of every doubt, every mocking word, every dismissive glance. She felt like running off the stage, out of the building, all the way home to her tiny bedroom, where she could play without anyone judging her. Then she thought about her grandmother. Not the sick woman in the hospital bed, but the young woman in the photograph, fierce and alive with her violin. She thought about all the stages Abuela Rosa had never stood on, all the audiences she'd never played for, all the chances she'd never gotten. Elena closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them, something had changed. The fear was still there, but it had transformed into something else. Energy, purpose, a burning need to be heard. She placed her bow on the strings and played the first note. It rang out clear and pure, cutting through the chatter of the audience like a bell. The note hung in the air, perfect and true, and Elena felt something inside her click into place. Her fingers began to move, and the opening phrase of the Paganini poured out into the hall. The technical term for what she was doing was simple. The opening of Caprice 24 starts relatively easy, a series of arpeggios that establish the theme, but there was nothing simple about the way Elena played it. Each note was precise, perfectly in tune, with a vibrato that made the sound shimmer like light on water. The audience began to quiet. People who had been whispering stopped mid-sentence. Programs lowered, heads turned toward the stage. Elena moved into the first variation, her fingers flying across the fingerboard in patterns that looked impossible, that were impossible for most violinists. The bow danced across the strings, producing cascades of notes that sounded like multiple instruments playing at once. Her left hand moved so fast it was almost a blur, executing double stops and triple stops that required hitting multiple strings simultaneously with perfect accuracy. In the front row, Professor Blackwell's arms uncrossed. He leaned forward slightly in his seat. The silver-haired professor's mouth had fallen open just a little. Elena wasn't thinking about them. She wasn't thinking about anyone. She had entered that place musicians talk about but can never quite explain. The place where you and the music become the same thing. Where your hands know what to do without your brain telling them. Where time stops meaning anything and the only thing that exists is the next note and the next and the next. The second variation was faster, more complex. Her bow flew across the strings in rapid-fire notes that most violinists couldn't even attempt at half the speed. But Elena's tempo was perfect, and every single note spoke clearly. There were no muddy runs, no fudged passages, just pure crystalline sound. By now, the entire audience had stopped what they were doing. Every eye was fixed on the stage, on this girl in her simple navy dress with her worn violin, producing sounds that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human capability. The third variation required left-hand pizzicato, plucking strings with the left hand while bowing with the right, creating 2 independent melodic lines simultaneously. It was a technique that looked like magic, that felt like magic. Elena's fingers moved in patterns she'd practiced 10,000 times, but now, with the adrenaline coursing through her veins and the weight of the moment surrounding her, it felt effortless. Elena's face was completely focused, her eyes half closed, her body swaying slightly with the music. Sweat was beginning to form on her forehead because this piece was physically exhausting, but she didn't notice. All she noticed was the music, the way her grandmother's violin sang under her fingers, the way the sound filled the massive hall and came back to her changed, amplified, alive. The hall had become completely still. Not the polite quiet of an audience trying to be respectful, but the breathless silence of people witnessing something extraordinary. Nearly 200 people sat frozen, barely daring to breathe, afraid that any sound they made might break the spell. Elena moved into Variation 7, and the complexity reached almost absurd levels. Her fingers were moving faster than seemed physically possible, creating a cascade of notes that poured from her violin like water from a fountain. Each note was crystal clear, perfectly in tune, placed with absolute precision. The bow moved across the strings in patterns that looked random but produced music of incredible beauty and logic. A woman in the fifth row, a piano teacher who had attended these recitals for 15 years, felt goosebumps rise on her arms. She'd heard the Paganini Caprice performed dozens of times by gifted students, by professionals, even once by a famous concert violinist, but she'd never heard it like this. This wasn't just technical mastery. This was something else. This was a story being told in a language older than words. Elena's body moved with the music now. Not in showy dramatic gestures, but in the natural flow of someone who had become one with their instrument. Her eyes were closed for some passages, open and distant for others. Sweat ran down her temple, but she didn't wipe it away. Her fingers were moving so fast they were almost a blur, dancing across the fingerboard in patterns that required years of muscle memory to execute. The accompanist, who had stayed backstage during the rehearsal disaster, stood in the wings now with her hand over her mouth. She'd been playing piano for 40 years, had accompanied hundreds of student recitals. She knew music. She knew talent. And what she was hearing now was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Professor Blackwell sat in the front row, and for the first time in 30 years of teaching, he felt his certainty crack and crumble. He'd been so sure, so absolutely convinced that this girl was out of her depth, that her audition tape must have been edited, that she was a diversity admission rather than a legitimate talent. But there was no editing this, no trick or illusion, just a girl and a violin and music that was rewriting everything he thought he knew. The eighth variation required left-hand technique, so advanced that it was usually considered the breaking point where most violinists failed. But Elena sailed through it like she was breathing. Her fingers moved independently, each one hitting its mark with impossible accuracy. The sound that came from her violin was so full, so rich, that it seemed impossible it was coming from a single instrument. In the back row, a young boy who had been dragged to the recital by his parents sat completely transfixed. He'd been planning to play games on his phone under his jacket, but he hadn't looked away from the stage since Elena had played her first note. He didn't understand music theory. He didn't know what a caprice was or why Paganini was famous, but he understood that he was watching someone do something amazing. And some part of him that he didn't even know existed was waking up. Elena reached the ninth variation, which featured rapid string crossings. The bow had to jump from one string to another with split-second timing, all while maintaining perfect rhythm and tone. Most violinists made these string crossings sound scratchy or harsh. Elena made them sound like birdsong. Each note rang out clear and bright, as if the strings themselves were singing. The music critic in the third row had stopped taking notes. His pen hovered over his notebook, but his hand was frozen. He'd reviewed hundreds of performances, had heard the world's greatest musicians, had developed what he thought was a professional detachment from the art itself. But tears were running down his cheeks now, and he didn't care who saw them. This performance would be the lead of his review. No, more than that. This would be the review he'd be talking about 20 years from now. Professor Chen, sitting next to Professor Blackwell, felt something like shame wash over him. He'd laughed. He'd actually laughed when Blackwell had suggested putting this girl first so the audience wouldn't be settled yet, so her inevitable failure wouldn't disrupt the real performances. He'd been part of the plan to minimize her, to erase her, and now, listening to her play, he understood that they hadn't been protecting the conservatory's reputation. They'd been protecting their own egos, their own narrow view of what talent looked like. The 10th variation was almost hypnotic. Elena's bow moved in long, flowing strokes that seemed to pull the music out of the air itself. The notes sang out with a purity that made people think of childhood memories, of first loves, of moments they'd forgotten they'd treasured. Music had that power when it was played right. It could reach inside you and touch places you didn't know existed. A famous violinist, who had graduated from Riverside decades ago, a man who had played with symphony orchestras around the world, sat in the audience with his wife. He leaned over and whispered to her, his voice shaking slightly. "That's her violin doing that, but it's also something more. It's like she's channeling something. I've never heard anything quite like it." His wife nodded, unable to speak. She wasn't a musician, but she didn't need to be. You didn't need to understand music theory to feel what Elena was creating. You just needed to be human. Elena moved into the variations that required ricochet bowing, where the bow bounces off the strings in rapid succession, creating a sound like coins scattering on a marble floor. It was one of the hardest techniques in violin playing, requiring a perfect balance of pressure and release. Too much pressure and the bow won't bounce. Too little and the sound dies. Elena's ricochet was perfect, each bounce producing a clear bell-like tone that danced through the hall. The silver-haired professor felt physically ill. She'd called this girl mediocre. She'd said she was only here because of diversity numbers. She'd laughed about her worn shoes and second-hand dress. And all the while, this girl had been carrying inside her something that most musicians never achieve in a lifetime, the ability to transcend technique and touch the soul. The 11th variation featured double and triple stops, playing 2 or 3 strings simultaneously. To create harmonies, it was difficult enough to play them in tune. To play them with the power and clarity Elena was producing was almost unheard of. Each chord rang out full and rich, filling the hall with sound that seemed to vibrate in people's chests. In the wings, other students who were scheduled to perform later stood watching, their own nervousness forgotten. A cellist who was supposed to play after the intermission felt her confidence waver. How could anyone follow this? A pianist who had spent months preparing his piece wondered if he should have chosen something more challenging, something that would make people feel the way they were feeling right now. But they also felt something else. Inspiration. Because Elena wasn't just playing music. She was showing what was possible when you loved something enough to give it everything you had. Elena reached the 12th variation, and her face showed the strain for the first time. Not in her playing. The notes continued to pour out perfect and true, but in the small tightening around her eyes, the sweat that now soaked her hairline, the way her breathing had become visible. This piece was a marathon, a test of endurance as much as skill. Her fingers were burning, her arm was aching, but she didn't slow down. If anything, she played with even more intensity. Professor Blackwell watched, and something broke inside him. Not just his certainty about this particular student. Something deeper. How many other students had he dismissed over the years? How many talents had he overlooked because they didn't fit his narrow definition of what a musician should look like, where they should come from, how they should present themselves? The thought made him feel smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. The 13th variation was coming. The one that most violinists dreaded. The one that combined every difficult technique into a single impossible passage. Left-hand pizzicato while bowing. Rapid position shifts, string crossings, harmonics, all at lightning speed. It was the variation where even great violinists sometimes faltered. Elena didn't falter. She attacked it with a ferocity that made people gasp out loud. Her fingers were a blur, moving across the strings in patterns that looked like magic. The sound that came from her violin was so complex, so layered, that it seemed impossible it was being created by one person. The audience had forgotten to breathe. People sat with their hands clutched together, their eyes wide, their mouths open. Some were crying openly now. Others were smiling with a kind of joy they hadn't felt in years. The music wasn't just reaching their ears. It was reaching somewhere deeper, somewhere that recognized truth when it heard it. And Elena played on. Her grandmother's violin singing under her fingers, telling a story of every person who had ever been underestimated, every dream that had been dismissed, every voice that had been silenced. The music rose and fell, danced and soared, wept and celebrated. It was everything Elena had inside her, poured out in notes and rhythms and harmonies that somehow made sense of the chaos. The final variation was approaching. The one that would end this impossible journey. The one that would prove once and for all that this quiet girl with her worn violin case and second-hand dress was not just good. She was extraordinary. Elena drew her bow across the strings for the final variation, and the sound that emerged was pure triumph. This was it, the culmination of everything that had come before. the place where all the technical brilliance and emotional depth converged into something that transcended music itself. Her fingers moved with a speed and precision that defied logic. The notes cascaded from her violin in impossible patterns, each one perfectly placed, perfectly timed, perfectly alive. The bow seemed to have a life of its own, dancing across the strings in movements so quick they were almost invisible. This wasn't just playing anymore. This was creation. This was taking sound and shaping it into something that had never existed before this moment. The final passage was approaching, the one that every violinist both dreaded and longed for. A series of rapid-fire notes that climbed higher and higher up the fingerboard, pushing the violin to the very edge of its range. Most performers took this section carefully, protecting themselves from the very real possibility of a mistake. But Elena didn't play it carefully. She played it fearlessly, her fingers flying up the neck, each note ringing out bright and true. And then the last phrase. Elena's whole body seemed to gather itself for this final moment. She lifted her bow high, and then brought it down across the strings with all the power she had left. The final note soared out into the hall, high, pure, triumphant, a sound that seemed to fill every corner of the massive space and still have room to grow. Elena held that note for what felt like forever, letting it ring out until it faded naturally into silence. Then she lowered her violin and her bow, standing absolutely still in the spotlight's glare. For 1 heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, 3. The hall remained completely silent. It was as if the entire audience had forgotten how to breathe, how to move, how to do anything except absorb what they had just witnessed. Then the silence shattered. The applause started somewhere in the middle of the hall, a single person clapping. Then 2, then 10, then suddenly everyone at once. But this wasn't the polite, measured applause audiences usually gave. This was an explosion of sound, a release of all the emotion that had been building for the past 10 minutes as they'd watched this girl do the impossible. People leaped to their feet. Not just a few scattered individuals, but the entire audience, row after row rising as one. The sound of their applause was like thunder, rolling through the hall, building and building until it seemed like the crystal chandeliers might shake loose from the ceiling. Elena stood on the stage, stunned. Her violin hung from one hand, her bow from the other. She blinked in the spotlight, not quite able to process what was happening. Her heart was pounding from the exertion of the performance. Her hands were shaking with exhaustion, and now her eyes were filling with tears that she couldn't stop. The applause continued. Someone in the back shouted, "Brava!" and others picked it up. "Brava, brava!" The word echoed through the hall, growing louder with each repetition. In the front row, Professor Blackwell sat frozen. Everyone around him was on their feet, clapping until their hands must have hurt. But he remained seated, his face the color of ash. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire worldview collapse. The silver-haired professor next to him was standing and applauding, but her face was streaked with tears. Whether from the beauty of the music or the shame of her earlier words, no one could say. The music critic in the third row was clapping and crying at the same time, not even trying to hide it anymore. He'd already decided this would be the lead story in tomorrow's paper. More than that, this would be the story he'd tell his grandchildren, the one he'd use to explain why music mattered. The famous violinist who had graduated from Riverside decades ago was on his feet, applauding so hard his hands were red. He turned to his wife with wonder in his eyes. "I've been playing for 40 years, he said, almost shouting to be heard over the applause. 40 years, and I've never heard the Paganini played like that. Never." The applause showed no signs of stopping. If anything, it was growing louder. Elena finally remembered to bow, a simple, humble dip of her head, and the audience roared even louder. Some people were whistling now, others stomping their feet. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, magnificent. Elena bowed again and her tears spilled over. She tried to wipe them away with the back of her hand, but they kept coming. These weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were relief, joy, disbelief, gratitude, and a dozen other emotions all mixed together. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. The artistic director of the conservatory, a distinguished woman in her 60s who rarely showed emotion, rushed from her seat in the back and headed toward the stage entrance. Her assistant tried to stop her, but she waved him off impatiently. This couldn't wait. Backstage, the students who had been watching from the wing stood in a cluster, their faces showing a mix of awe and something like fear. A cellist turned to her friend and whispered, "How are we supposed to go on after that?" Her friend could only shake her head, speechless. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Elena bowed twice more, and each time the audience responded with renewed energy. Finally, exhausted and overwhelmed, she picked up her violin case, placed her grandmother's violin carefully inside, and walked off the stage. The moment she disappeared into the wings, her legs nearly gave out. The accompanist caught her arm, steadying her. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her eyes wide with concern and amazement. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. Her whole body was shaking now, from exhaustion, from adrenaline, from the weight of what had just happened finally hitting her. But there was no time to recover. The artistic director appeared, moving faster than anyone had ever seen her move. She took Elena's free hand in both of hers. "My dear," she said, her voice intense. "My dear girl, why haven't we been featuring you? Why didn't anyone tell me we had someone of your caliber?" Elena opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked at the artistic director in confusion. What did she mean? Why didn't anyone tell her? Elena was on the program. She'd auditioned. She was a student here. "We need to talk," the artistic director continued, still holding Elena's hand. "After the recital, we need to discuss your future, your performance schedule, everything. What you just did out there." She paused, shaking her head in wonder. "In 30 years of running this conservatory, I've never seen anything like that." Other people were crowding around now. Students Elena had never spoken to. Faculty members she'd only seen from a distance, administrators in suits. Everyone wanted to congratulate her, to touch her arm, to be close to whatever magic had just happened on that stage. "How long have you been playing?" someone asked. "Where did you study before?" Another voice chimed in. "That violin, what make is it?" The tone was incredible. "Have you considered applying for the Young Artist program?" Elena felt dizzy. It was too much, too many people, too many questions. Her hands were still shaking, and she desperately wanted to sit down, to drink some water, to process what had just happened. But people kept pressing closer, kept talking at her, kept looking at her like she was something rare and precious they'd just discovered. "Give her some space." The accompanist's voice cut through the chaos.
"Can't you see she just played the most demanding piece in the violin repertoire?"
"Let her breathe." The crowd backed off slightly, but their eyes remained fixed on Elena, hungry and amazed. Out in the hall, the audience had finally begun to settle, taking their seats again. But the energy in the room had completely changed. People weren't rustling programs anymore. They weren't whispering to each other or checking their phones. They were leaning forward in anticipation, wondering if what came next could possibly match what they'd just witnessed. Professor Blackwell finally stood on shaky legs and made his way backstage. He found Elena surrounded by admirers and pushed through the crowd with the authority of his position. When he reached her, he stopped, and for a long moment he just looked at her. His face was still pale, but there was something else there now, something that might have been respect or shame, or maybe both. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, and his voice was different from before. Smaller somehow. I owe you an apology. Several apologies, in fact." Elena looked at him, at this man who had dismissed her, who had mocked her, who had arranged her performance to minimize the damage he was certain she would cause. She waited for the anger to come, the satisfaction of seeing him proven wrong, but all she felt was tired and, strangely, a little sad for him. "I misjudged you," Professor Blackwell continued, the words seeming to cost him something. "Badly, completely. I've been teaching for 30 years, and I've never been more wrong about a student. What you did out there," he paused, searching for words. "That was exceptional. Beyond exceptional." Elena nodded slowly. She wanted to say something cutting, something that would make him feel as small as he'd made her feel, but her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "When you play, you speak a language everyone understands." She'd already said everything she needed to say. She'd said it with music in front of 200 people. What more could words add? "Thank you," Elena said simply. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to find some water." She moved past him, past all of them, and found a quiet corner backstage. The video appeared online the next morning. Someone in the audience had recorded Elena's entire performance on their phone, and by sunrise, it was making its way across the internet like wildfire. By noon, it had been shared 10,000 times. By evening, it had reached 500,000 views. Elena knew nothing about this at first. She'd gone home after the recital and slept for 12 hours straight, exhausted in a way she'd never been before. When she finally woke up and checked her phone, she found it flooded with messages, hundreds of them. Her mother had called 17 times. Her brother had sent a string of texts that were mostly just exclamation points and heart emojis, but it was the text from Mr. Patterson, her old music teacher, that made her start to understand what was happening. "Elena, you're everywhere. Turn on the news." She opened her laptop, still in her pajamas, and searched her name. The results made her breath catch in her throat. The music critic from the recital had published his review at dawn. The headline read, "Unknown violinist delivers performance of a lifetime at Riverside Conservatory." The article was glowing, calling her performance transcendent and the finest interpretation of Paganini's Caprice I've witnessed in my 20-year career. He'd given it 5 stars and ended with, "Mark my words, you'll be hearing the name Elena Rodriguez for years to come." But it wasn't just one review. Major classical music blogs had picked up the story. Social media was buzzing. Professional musicians were sharing the video and adding their own commentary. A famous conductor had tweeted, "This is why we need music education. This is why art matters. This girl just reminded us what the human spirit can do." Elena's phone rang. It was the artistic director of the conservatory. "Elena, I hope you're sitting down," she said. "We've had 12 calls this morning. 12. From major orchestras, music festivals, concert halls. Everyone wants to book you. The Chicago Symphony wants you for their Young Artists Showcase. The Boulder Music Festival is offering you a featured spot. And there are 3 different conservatories asking if you'd consider transferring, with full scholarships." Elena listened, unable to speak. This couldn't be real. 24 hours ago, professors had been laughing about her inevitable failure. Now orchestras were calling. "There's more," the artistic director continued. "We're holding an emergency faculty meeting this afternoon to discuss our audition and scholarship processes. What happened to you, the way you were treated? That can't happen again. We need to make changes." After she hung up, Elena sat staring at her laptop screen, watching her own performance. The video quality wasn't great. It had been filmed from the middle of the audience on someone's phone. But she could hear everything clearly. She could see herself walking onto that stage, small and nervous. And then she could hear the transformation as the music took over. Reading the comments under the video was surreal. Thousands of people from all over the world, sharing how her performance had moved them. A woman in Japan wrote that she'd been about to quit violin after years of struggling, but hearing Elena play had made her fall in love with music again. A man in Brazil said he'd played the video for his daughter and told her, "This is what's possible when you work hard and never give up." But it was a comment from someone named Patricia Martinez that made Elena's eyes fill with tears. "I'm Elena's mother. I want you all to know that her grandmother taught her to play on a violin from a pawn shop in our tiny apartment. We never had money for fancy schools or private lessons, but Elena practiced 8 hours a day because she loved it. She worked 3 jobs to save money for her conservatory application, and when professors told her she wasn't good enough, she proved them wrong. I've never been more proud of anyone in my life." Elena called her mother immediately. "Mama, why did you write that?" Her mother's voice was thick with emotion. "Because people need to know the truth, mija. They need to know that talent doesn't only come from expensive schools and wealthy families. They need to know that a girl from our neighborhood can stand on a stage with all those rich people and be the best one there." 3 days later, Elena was invited to give an interview to a major music magazine. They sent a professional journalist to meet her at a coffee shop near the conservatory. The woman was in her 40s with kind eyes and a recording device that she placed carefully on the table between them. "First," the journalist said, "I want to tell you that your performance made me cry. I'm not even particularly musical, but I sat at my desk and watched that video 3 times in a row and I cried every time." Elena smiled. "Thank you. That means a lot. So let's start at the beginning. When did you start playing violin?" Elena told her story. About her grandmother, about the tiny apartment, about the pawnshop violin and the countless hours of practice, about winning regional competitions and earning small scholarships for summer programs, about Mr. Patterson, who had taught her advanced techniques and encouraged her to dream bigger than her circumstances suggested she should. "And the audition for Riverside," the journalist prompted. "How did that go?" Elena hesitated. "It was complicated. I couldn't afford to travel there for a live audition, so I submitted a recording. I made it in my bedroom using my phone. I didn't have professional equipment or a sound engineer or anything like that. Just me and my violin. The professors seemed shocked by your performance at the recital, the journalist said carefully. Were you expecting that reaction? This was the moment Elena had been dreading. She could lie. She could be diplomatic. She could protect the conservatory's reputation and her own future there. Or she could tell the truth. She thought about all the other students like her, the talented kids from poor families, from small towns, from places that people like Professor Blackwell dismissed without a second thought. She thought about her grandmother, who had never gotten the chances she deserved because people had judged her by her circumstances rather than her abilities. They didn't expect me to be good, Elena said quietly. Some of the professors thought I was only admitted because of diversity quotas, not because of my talent. They scheduled me first before the audience was fully seated, because they thought I'd be a disaster and they wanted to minimize the damage. I heard them talking about it. The journalist's eyes widened. They told you this? Not to my face, but I heard them. Elena took a deep breath. I want to be clear. I'm not trying to attack anyone, but I think it's important for people to know that this happens. Talented students get overlooked all the time because they don't fit the expected image, because they're poor, or they're from the wrong neighborhood, or they show up in a second-hand dress instead of designer clothes. And how do you feel about those professors now? Elena considered this. I think they learned something. I hope they learned something. Professor Blackwell apologized to me, and I believe he meant it. But individual apologies aren't enough. The system needs to change. Auditions should be truly blind, just the music, nothing else. Students should be judged by their talent, not by where they come from or what they can afford to wear. The interview was published a week later, and it sparked a national conversation. Other students came forward with similar stories from conservatories and music schools across the country. Parents shared experiences of their children being dismissed or discouraged because they didn't fit the traditional mold. Professional musicians spoke about the biases they'd faced in their own careers. Riverside Conservatory responded by implementing new policies. All auditions would now be conducted behind screens, with identifying information removed from applications until after admission decisions were made. The scholarship program was expanded and renamed the Rosa Martinez Scholarship Program in honor of Elena's grandmother, and Professor Blackwell resigned from his position as head of the strings department, though he would continue teaching, under much closer supervision. Elena received dozens of offers in the following months. Prestigious conservatories wanted her to transfer. Concert halls wanted her to perform. Record labels wanted to sign her. It was overwhelming, wonderful, and terrifying all at once. But there was one offer that stood out from all the others. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra invited her to be their featured soloist for their annual benefit concert. The piece they wanted her to play? Paganini's Caprice No. 24. Elena accepted. The concert was scheduled for 6 months later, giving her time to prepare and to finish her first year at Riverside. Those months were strange and wonderful. Other students who had ignored her before now wanted to be her friend. Professors who had dismissed her now fought to teach her. She was featured in the conservatory's promotional materials, her face appearing on brochures and websites. But Elena tried to stay grounded. She practiced every day, just like always. She ate lunch with the accompanist who had been kind to her from the beginning. She video called her family every week, and they'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. And every night before bed, she'd take out her grandmother's violin and play that folk song from the small village in Mexico. The one she'd played at the funeral. The one that reminded her where she came from and why any of this mattered. The night of the Chicago Symphony performance arrived. Elena stood backstage at Symphony Center, a venue so famous that its name made her dizzy.